Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar on outbreak coordination, exploring opportunities and barriers for greater non-governmental organization engagement, hosted by the READY Initiative, which is funded by the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. During this webinar, we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're happy to provide live interpretation into Spanish, French, and Arabic for today's webinar. If you're interested in listening to the session in one of these languages, please click the globe icon that says interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select your desired language. Access to today's recording will be available after the webinar on the READY website, ready-initiative.org. And it is now my pleasure to turn it over to today's event moderator, David Whitewick, CEO of UK Med. David, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Vasika. And thank you and welcome to everyone for coming along to the webinar. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Just a bit of introduction about the purpose of all of this, why we're here. This is the official launch of the latest READY document, and I better get the title right of this one precisely. So it's a guide on infectious disease outbreak response coordination, an introductory guide for non-governmental organizations. And the intent of this is to give people a grounding in what happens in infectious disease outbreak coordination and how these structures are put in place. The part of the purpose, the reason behind this guide, why we put all this together, is because it can be a confusing topic. Contexts are all different. Ministries of health all operate in different ways. Countries and communities have different ways of looking at outbreaks, of responding to them. And all of these result in a confusing pattern or plethora of different coordination mechanisms. However, there are some things that hold true. There are some basic norms. There are organizations that traditionally take part in these things. There are ways that things get done, which may be confusing or opaque, or let's put it this way, untransparent to many organizations. And I think the feeling has been that over the past few years or so, with an increasing number of significant infectious disease outbreaks, that we're probably not managing to utilize the full breadth of talent, expertise, experience, and community networks that there are out there, and harness them to respond more effectively to disease outbreaks. So the guide was an attempt to improve that situation and move it along a bit. You can find the guide on the READY website, and it is available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. I think the link is going into the chat. Yep, great, thank you. But back to the webinar and today. And what we wanted to explore today is there are, of course, a very wide range of issues around infectious disease outbreak, technical, logistics, security, the sheer difficulty of organizing your own agency, and making sure that an organization is prepared, both mentally prepared, logistically prepared, has the human resources available to actually deal with these things. But once an infectious disease outbreak occurs and a coordination mechanism, be that a task force or some of these emergency operations centers that are quite a significant part of how things are organized, once these come into play, it can be a challenge for organizations, international or national NGOs, to fully access the coordination mechanism to get their voice heard and to feed in the expertise, the skills, all the resources that they may have. Now, the challenge here is, how do we best inform people of the variety of mechanisms the sort of best way to position themselves to access those coordination mechanisms and how they can play an active and productive part and contribute significantly. So in order to explore some of these issues, we have a great panel today. People who bring a lot of experience and knowledge to the subject, and who have themselves played a very significant part in coordinating infectious disease outbreaks in a whole range of different contexts and locations. And first of all, I'll just introduce them. And the first one I want to bring up is Linda Dool, who is the Global Health Cluster Coordinator with WHO. I won't embarrass Linda by mentioning how long she has been in the sector and the experience she brings to it. Suffice it to say that it is very significant. And Linda is one of the world's experts, frankly, in how we coordinate health responses around the world. Linda has worked with Medical Aid for Palestinians, with Médecins Sans Frontières, with Merlin, and took up the role of Global Health Cluster Coordinator in 2014. She is responsible under WHO leadership for overall coordination and strategic direction of one of the leading global partnerships for humanitarian health action. So it's great pleasure to welcome Linda onto our panel. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Emmanuel Barasa, Health Cluster Coordinator and part of Save the Children. Emmanuel is a public health professional with 11 years of experience in international development and humanitarian response. He's currently seconded to WHO by Save the Children and is working in South Sudan in Jonglei as the Health Cluster Coordinator. Then thirdly, I'd like to introduce, and I have practiced my pronunciation of Virginie's name, so Virginie Lefebvre. She's head of program and partnerships at Amal Association International. She's a jurist who's been working for more than 15 years with NGOs in the health and human rights sectors, and is now head of programs and partnerships at Amal Association International, which is a Lebanese NGO. Co-leading the health sector, also a member of the Lebanon Humanitarian and Development NGOs Forum, and steering committee of the ICVA board. And lastly, but by no means least, and sitting out al fresco outside his home, is Paul Lopodo, and his technical lead Ebola response in Uganda for Save the Children. I think you've just left that post, so you've sort of got the experience that we want to bring out on that one. And he's got over 19 years of humanitarian and development experience, most recently in Uganda, deployed as the Ebola technical and national response lead, and has worked previously in other Save the Children international Ebola responses, particularly in DRC, Guinea-Conakry, as both technical operation and Ebola response lead. So thank you enormously to all of the panel for coming along to share your experience and your knowledge with us. How we're going to arrange this is we have a number of questions for the panel. We encourage the panel to talk around these questions and to develop their experience, as we mentioned earlier, I think to luxuriate perhaps in the conversation. But initially, we're asking people to be quite tight with their comments on the first question. And I think we're just going to give each panelist a few minutes just to introduce themselves into the discussion. And to lead off on this, I'd ask Linda, if you could just reflect for us on the question, which is, how do we encourage a larger number of organizations to meaningfully engage in outbreak response? And how do we bring them in? How do we make this happen? Linda, if just a few pithy points.
A few pithy points. Thanks, David, and greetings to everybody online. Great to see such a large turnout. So meaningfully engage, how do we do that? So from a health cluster perspective, I'm going to say that we already have the potential to have significant meaningful engagement, as we already have 900 partners across something like 30 humanitarian settings. And in principle, all those partners can engage in outbreak response, which clusters deal with on a daily basis. But we also know through experience, and I have to say coordination, whether it's outbreaks or humanitarian, is very much learning by doing. We know from experience that not all partners do have the capacity or ability to meaningfully engage. And that really comes down to a couple of things which we've identified through partner capacity surveys we've done. And really the questions are, does your organization have the technical expertise and operational capacity to respond to the different requirements of different outbreaks? While many of the principles of outbreaks response are common, certain modalities are required for different types of outbreaks. And what we've seen among some of the cluster partners is great expertise in certain areas. For example, 2/3 of our partners are national local partners who are extremely well placed in communities where outbreaks start and finish, and have strong capacities in community engagement. But they maybe have less capacity in other areas around case management or laboratory support or whatever. Similarly, what we see is some of our partners, both international and national, do not have sufficient surge capacity to have that rapid response to a new outbreak which takes place. So again, how do you do that? These are questions for your organizations to have a strategic discussion and decide, do you want to invest in that capacity to be a meaningful partner and meaningful engage in outbreak response? Then the other one is understand coordination. And I say that sitting with my gray hair, still working out what coordination is about on a daily basis, because it changes. It will never look the same in every country, but there are some fundamental principles that everybody can learn. Much of that information is available, but I do say, and not just because I'm saying it in front of David, the guide that Ready is launching today is a very useful tip sheet to understand some of the key principles. And it is beholden on you, if you're a partner who considers yourself to be relevant for outbreak response, to familiarize yourself with this coordination knowledge, and then engage, communicate, engage, share information, be visible, be present, and be very clear what your offer is to that particular outbreak response. I will stop there. Thank you.
Linda, thank you very much. And Emmanuel, if I can bring you in, and the same question to you. How do we encourage a larger number of organizations to meaningfully engage in outbreak response?
Thank you, Paul. I think the key word there is meaningfully engage. I would like to give a field-based scenario of what we do at the subnational level in terms of health cluster coordination. On my part, I think we shouldn't wait till there is an outbreak to begin an engagement. We start early enough. We develop state level health cluster work plans early in the year, in January. And then among other components of that will be a component of contingency planning. Now, in our setting, the seasons are very clear. We have dry season response and the rainy season response. So we develop contingency plans for the state for the two seasons. Usually, you will find that during the dry season, there will be outbreak of diseases, for example, measles and also conflicts. During the dry season, there will be accessibility issues, floodings, and waterborne diseases. So when we were developing a contingency plan, we developed jointly with health cluster partners. So in that way, they feel engaged in part of the process, both the work plan and the contingency plans, with clear level of responsibilities and support that each and every partner is supposed to provide. For me, my experience is that if people find that something is beneficial, they are willing to engage more. So my take will be that as the health cluster coordination team, we need to make our health cluster partners feel that this coordination is important. They are supported in terms of various components, advocacy, technically, and any other support that they may need, and as well that they're delivering on their mandate. So apart from the contingency plan, now partners will also develop their individual contingency.
I think we lost the feed there. Is that right, Fasika? In which case I'll move on. So to Virginie, if I can put an alternative question to you, because I think we've got the sort of picture of, you know, coordination planning at that subnational or even global level, the need for organizations to better prepare themselves, frankly, in order to ensure that they have both the will and the ability to engage fully. But from your side, what would you consider to be the main barriers or opportunities to engagement from the NGO side?
Thanks, David. And let me address both barriers very quickly, but then focus on opportunities, because I think this is the reason why we're here today. And that just maybe a note for everybody, whatever I'm going to be saying today is indeed informed by my functions as a health sector co-lead. The agency I'm working with is the health sector co-lead in Lebanon, but I'm also a member of the steering committee of the local NGOs forum. So definitely there are different realities across local and national NGOs. And I think that this is quite important to remember, is that we cannot generalize things, even though we're all aiming at streamlining different lessons learned. So in terms of barriers, and this is really based on my experience of being involved in the cholera and COVID-19 response in Lebanon. First barrier is really the multiplication of response framework that are really not facilitating for local and national NGOs, but I think also for NGOs in general, the identification of entry points in joining outbreak coordination response. If you don't know which meeting you should be attending, which space is dedicated for you, it's quite difficult to engage with those different fora. Then the second thing is online meetings or capital-based meetings, not facilitating in particular local actors joining the different coordination mechanisms because of connectivity and transportation issues. So true, those online meetings are facilitating more participation, but is it really meaningful if you can hear one word out of two? This is a question we have to ask ourselves. And then I think the third barrier is the language, but I'm not referring here only to English. For me, the most important barrier is around the jargon, the acronyms we're using. Often in country, the expertise is not so much about the global jargon, but more about how do you contextualize them. And unfortunately, and again, if we're using this very specialized language without contextualizing it, we're going to have more of a tokenistic approach towards engagement as opposed to meaningful contribution of local and national actors. Now, some opportunities. Definitely having local NGOs, and this is not only valid for outbreak response, I think it's valid across all humanitarian sectors. Having local NGOs co-leading sectors does really facilitate the outreach to those non-traditional actors, being municipalities, being NGOs, being the government. And they are really instrumental in creating spaces for informal interaction between the traditional actors and the non-traditional actors. Second opportunity for me is having a government ensuring their leadership role in the response, because then no one is questioning the ownership of the outbreak response. And then you can support the government with how should they reach out to the traditional actors and so on and so forth. In Lebanon, we've been seeing it with the cholera response, which has been actively led by the Minister of Public Health. And this really made a difference if you compare it to the COVID-19 response. Then definitely coordination at the capital level does not solve everything. So we really have to move towards area-based coordination and to have, and I saw it in the question and answer, to have clear accountability mechanisms and communication channels between the capital-based coordination mechanism and all those area-based coordination mechanisms to ensure that information flows from both sides, but also that decision made at the central level are being reflected at the local level, and that whatever is the reality at the local level is actually impacting the decision made at the central level. And then maybe two very quick last point. I think for me, an opportunity is really to have donors on board for funding liaison coordination positions, supporting local NGOs fora, but as well supporting pooled resources for local and national actors to have dedicated staff for coordination. So it doesn't mean to have a budget line in each and single grant, but it means really having pooled resources. And then a last point is really simplifying our response frameworks, because having 10 different or 5 different response frameworks really does not facilitate the engagement of actors. And there's also something for us as local and national NGOs to raise our collective awareness and to build our collective understanding of what is this collective coordination mechanism, to make sure that we can engage, but also that we can prioritize over those hundreds of meetings happening on a monthly basis.
Virginie, thank you for those some interesting points that resonate with all of us probably. Paul, if I can move to you in the same question, what would you consider to be the main barriers or opportunities to engagement?
Thank you very much, David, and hope I'm very clear. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, rest of the colleagues, wherever you are. In terms of the barriers, I think Virginia has mentioned some of them, but I will really focus on my experience, based on my experience in different countries that I've worked with Save the Children, with MSF and other organizations. In terms of the barriers, one of the most important barriers that really I've seen across is really solo adaptation and sign off of some of most important guidelines, WHO recommended guidelines during outbreaks. For example, there is really a lot of laxity or bottleneck really comes about when some of these guidelines of the response plans really get delayed in terms of really executing them or even signing off by the different governments. So this is really been a challenge all through. I give a recent example in Uganda, for example. The response plan just came in just in December when the cases of Ebola was really declining and we were almost out of Ebola. So really delays in approving these guidelines and documents really poses a big challenge. That we should really ensure that the next time we have a response plan prepared in advance based on WHO guidelines and really promptly adjust them or just sign off them immediately once the outbreaks comes in. What we have also seen for some time is sensitivity or probably laxity by the different governments to respond or even talk about certain kind of outbreaks, or like, for example, cholera. My experience in Uganda, in Pakistan, sometimes back in 2010, when we had the flooding in Pakistan, and also in Ethiopia in 2017, Jiktiga, cholera. But the government really asked, like, we should not really talk about cholera, but we just talk about watery diarrhea. And this is really compromises the kind of the coordination and even the treatment plans of the outbreaks that are there. Something else that really we have seen as a key barrier is a weak health system and coordination. As you all are aware, Ebola outbreaks such as Ebola has tested really the readiness of the health systems across the countries in the world. And there have been a lot of competition in terms of resources. Whenever we go to this kind of coordination, we have so many organizations, local or national or international organizations, really compete for the resources. And some of these you find some of them really come in just not really to provide or to give what they will be able to provide, but they're only looking for funding. My experience in Yemen in 2017, when I was the co-lead for health cluster, when I was sharing the response, the cholera task force, we could be able to see that most of these organizations actually were like kind of what we call it briefcase organizations, coming just there to represent themselves and then listen, and then they go out and they don't really, and they're looking for funding, and rarely they cannot be able to implement, or they do not have a capacity to implement. And this is really a key barrier in these coordinations. Another issue that really talk about is the context barrier to many of the international organizations. So we really tend to collect a lot of prevalence only and health system challenges, but the structural arrangement of the community, for example, and the dynamics of the community, sometimes we are not aware. So this is why I think the local organizations coming in really plays a key role during emergencies. There is also duplication of space and to respond, resulting to really duplicating the response and waste of the resources. In Haiti in 2016, when we were doing supporting the Hurricane Matthew response, what we noticed with the Children Emergency Health Team was actually the first on the ground with the WHO, and then when we were doing the primary health care and some mobile clinics, and of course cholera response, we saw just a day we leave to a mobile clinic, and next another organization comes in and puts its own tent. So this kind of really absence of mapping really played a very big role in this, like there's no really proper coordination of these organizations during these kind of outbreaks. And this really led to waste of resources and really some of the most crucial needs being not really met.
Paul, if I can just interrupt you there, because I think a number of the issues that you're starting to raise, we're going to bring out in the subsequent chat and some of the Q&A. I think a lot of what everybody has brought out is really familiar, I think, to all of us. So thank you very much, panelists, for laying the ground excellently. And I'm gonna move on just to explore some of these a little bit further, and we're encouraging questions, Q&A from everybody online, and I think the question really to all panelists at this one is just getting a little bit more in depth, is how do we establish greater shared understanding of outbreak response coordination? So looking at all the issues, Emmanuel, that you were raising, Virginie, some of the ones that you were as well, especially that access for national level organizations and the lack of linguistic transparency that often is symptomatic of, you know, highly technical responses. So to all panelists, how do we establish a greater shared understanding of outbreak response coordination? And if I can, well, I'm not necessarily keeping with the same order, but in this case, I'm going to plump for Linda. So Linda, would you like to give your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I think in terms of shared understanding, so what have we learned? And I think there's a lot of learning has been captured around outbreak preparedness, readiness and response and the coordination within that. But I think the way that learning has often been articulated is focusing on what doesn't work as opposed to what does work. So I think there's a visibility issue on sharing some of those lessons learned in a more positive way. I think certainly from a cluster perspective, work that we've done, evaluations from Nigeria, Mozambique, on the aftermath of the Yemen response, with WASH cluster, we looked at cholera coordination. One of the key things is obviously understanding respective roles and responsibilities in coordination, whether that's through the national authorities or the potential and respective roles that agencies can play, international, national, UN agencies. Again, that's not going to look the same in each country, but understanding where people bring, again, their comparative advantage to that. And what we've seen is for those roles and responsibilities are not clear, that's where confusion and duplication takes place. I think it was Virginia, you mentioned entry points. And again, it's making it clear to everybody, where can they take, what is that entry point? Is it to help co-lead a particular pillar, thematic pillar within an outbreak response? Is it about helping the delivery of part of the outbreak response? Is it local coordination? So I think, again, having more in-depth conversations around these through different fora. A piece of work that we're just finalising now within the cluster is looking at coordination for COVID-19. And certainly one of the big themes that comes out of that is the need for local peer-to-peer learning. So at that point about decentralizing and sharing that experience at the most local level amongst local and national partners. So again, putting that into a context and a relevance of the roles that certain individuals and organizations can play. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want one, I've got a couple of questions in the chat here. And there's one which it says, my question is simple. Not sure about that. My question is simple. Who is the lead coordinator in an outbreak? Well, there is a simple answer to that, and it's the Ministry of Health. However, that can hide a multitude of issues, and I think some of those have been brought out by Paul in terms of the oftentimes lack of transparency at governmental level in dealing with outbreaks, which can lead to late responses. But yeah, in theory, it's the Ministry of Health. It's their country, it's their response. But that can be, it can present a lot of challenges, and politically it can be difficult. But again, back to the question, how do we establish this greater shared understanding of outbreak response coordination? And Emmanuel, can I jump to you on this one? Your experience of the sort of subcluster lead here. How do you think we establish a greater shared understanding of the coordination of these things?
Thank you very much, David. I think there are various ways of establishing a greater shared understanding of outbreak coordination. And I think, first of all, is to all the partners and all the responsible stakeholders to be aware that response coordination is a holistic responsibility for each and everyone. We should as well be cognizant of context-specific needs in terms of access. In some of the contexts we work in, as some of my previous speakers mentioned, access could be very, very constrained and limited, even to government officials. In some contexts, based on ethnic issues, they may not be able to access. So we need to understand those aspects and see to it, is it a national partner that can be able to access that location and be supported if it with the capacity to be able to respond. I think the major issue also comes with the resources. How are we transparent and open in terms of advocacy of resources? For example, in our context, when partners are maybe seeking a rapid response funds, to respond to an outbreak, usually the head cluster will be reached to provide inputs and recommendations. How are we doing that? Do we have context specific needs? Do we understand the partner so that whatever recommendations you are giving are scientific, and that we understand that the partner will be able to deliver? Lastly, David, before I give back the mic to you, is outbreak response, post-outbreak response evaluation. Very, very, very key to understand what worked and what didn't work, and what, how do we improve? So if we do that holistically, then I think we'll have a shared understanding. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you. Got a great one here, which is, what are the tips? And this related very much to this question of the greater understanding. But what are the tips on effectively engaging partners when working in a country where we have dual or different governments? So differing contexts. I'm trying to think who to put this one to. It's probably Emmanuel or Virginie, I think. Sorry, Paul. I'll go with you. Do you have any thoughts on this one? How do we deal with outbreak response in a country in which you might have dual governments or areas which are difficult to access? And then Emmanuel, if you have any points on this, because you've just been working in a similar context to this, that would be quite interesting. But Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
This is thank you, David. This is typically, I think, the context of Yemen in 2017 when we had like different governments, one in Sana'a and the other one in Aden in the south, and we had like different governments. I think this question is really like, how should we ensure that we run the programs quite well? When I was the cluster, we ran the outbreaks. We support the outbreaks quite well. When I was in Yemen, for example, in 2017. Thanks, Linda, you were together. You came to Yemen that time. When we were in Yemen, what we were doing was to try to ensure that we get a good representation by bringing in the people really that are coming from those specific areas, trying to train them, build capacity, some of the sub-cluster coordinators in Sana'a. Then we trained them, like we went through a kind of a module to train, to ensure that they gain the knowledge how to respond, how to ensure that they can be able to coordinate the responses. And in so doing, we sent these kind of teams to the south where the government was not really controlling. The Sana'a government was not controlling. So we could be able to support both ends of the other side of the south and also on the north. So one way was to build the capacity from both sides, and then the humanitarian organizations are always neutral and independent, and are always trying to they are there to provide the medical or the humanitarian services, and less of really government or any other. We are neutral. So in so doing, so we ensure that we maintain the humanitarian principles in so providing our responses. I think this is what I can say for this kind of question, because we supported both ends by bringing people from different parts of the country, then training them, capacitate them, and then send them back to those areas. And this is how we supported them. Thank you. And over to you, David.
Thank you very much. There's one more I have here. So Virginie, to you, I'm gonna ask a sort of double-loaded question here. One is the question that we started with, which how do we establish a greater shared understanding of coordination? And following up, there's a sort of practical question here: is what is the coordination typically between the NGO and health authorities? So does the NGO apply their own response plan, or is it the authorities' response plan? How does that work?
Let me start with the second one, David, because I think this is the easiest but most complicated one at the same time. I think there's not one single answer to this, and it's not only from one country to another, it's from one response to another. We would all agree in theory that we have to apply the government response plan, framework, and so on and so forth. But what if it has not been updated? What if it cannot be enforced? So often we have to find a middle ground between what has been in theory designed by the government and what is practically be implemented. And I'm going to link it up to the shared understanding question. I think this is why it's so important, and it has been mentioned by Linda, it has been mentioned by Emmanuel, to have lessons learned exercise that are not only being done at the end of the response, that are being done throughout the response, and that are actually being disseminated so that we can update those preparedness guideline document. This is often the issue we're having, is that we're into the middle of the thing and we have no time to capitalize on what has happened before. This is particularly true, to be honest, with international organization, given the turnover rate, right? We have to take this into consideration as well. Then quickly, two additional points regarding the collective understanding. I think it is also important whenever we're talking about lessons learned and evaluation exercise that we are sharing those with the existing structures. And this does not sit only with health. It means that we also have to share it with our WASH colleagues, with our protection colleagues, to get their feedback. We tend to be very, very health focused and to forget that we have lots of others, sectors, clusters that are actively contributing to the response, and they do really contribute to this shared understanding. And then I think a point that we've not been really tackling today, but the shared understanding is not only about the actors of the response. Well, they are actors of the response, but it's also about the affected communities. They have to understand what went wrong, what went well, and why, so that we can get their buy-in in future responses. That's one of the issue I think we're all having with the COVID-19 response, right? Is that there are misconception around the response coming, or even good conception, I'm sure in certain contexts, coming from the affected communities. We have to make sure that we address those with them and that we actively involve them in this shared understanding beyond what we're already doing with the RCC, so the communication with the affected communities.
Okay. Thank you, and I've got a great one here, which speaks to some of the stuff that Paul, I think you were bringing out earlier, Manuel, I think you were as well, which is how do we ensure? I mean, I'm going to go around the question. How do we ensure good coordination when we have the potential for co-leads within a coordination structure competing for funding with everybody else? How do we then ensure that we have good, transparent coordination in such a set of circumstances? Who shall I pick on for this one? Paul, I think you raised the issue of resources, and initially, and I think let's jump to you, and then I'll probably throw that to someone else as well. Paul. Oh, you're muted, or audio's gone? Yeah, you're muted.
Yes, David, you can hear me and the rest of the colleagues? Yeah. This is a tricky one. How we should be able to ensure coordination when we have the co-leads. I think what I've seen so far, we have the co-leads in different, depending on the sectors that we have, like WASH or education or health, we have the co-leads, and different partners really share or send their staffs to either to co-lead in WHO. But I think we should be able to harmonize the way we work. We should be able to really prioritize from the priorities, and we should be able to really do proper mapping of where and when the 5 Ws, where and what each partner is doing, and what and then we bring everybody together on board. Because if we have different co-leads, people doing, and then different coordinations all together, then we can be able, and we are serving the same population or same community, then we can be able to, it's a kind of a waste of resources or waste of time as such. So it would be good in such a kind of situations, it would be good really, like the head of the cluster, if we have a cluster in the country office, in that country, if we have a cluster, then the cluster really bring all these kind of coordinators or different co-leads together. So I think this is maybe something we can be able to, if we have a big kind of a magnitude response, then the cluster really takes on or supports in bringing all these kind of different co-leads and the coordinators into one table and then discuss all these issues. So this is what I can say. Thanks to you.
So talk it out, I think, is essentially the answer there, and I can see that one would be not an unreasonable way forward. Linda, I'm just going to quickly jump to you. This competition for resources, and I'm going to link it in with the question that was brought up earlier about the potential for funding to engage in coordination at all, because that ability to engage in coordination is often beyond some organizations, particularly the smaller ones, potentially national ones, and those organizations might have excellent community penetration that is needed, but how do we get them into that coordination mechanism?
So I think we need to be bolder on a number of accounts. We all talk around the subject for many years, but I think now is the time to be bold on some of this. I think on the competition of the co-leads, I would argue that if we are collectively responding to an outbreak of X with a joint plan, that we have a clear multi-sectoral strategy or even a joint health sector strategy, but preferably a multi-sectoral strategy, why aren't we also applying for multi-sectoral funding, which we are seeing, and which there's certainly a push to in a number of the cluster countries, sometimes for outbreaks, but now also for issues around food security. So we have examples of where health, wash, nutrition, food security clusters are submitting joint proposals to donors, which includes within those proposals funding for partners taking on particular technical service delivery functions, but also coordination functions. So we need to change the mindset. If we're trying to have a non-fragmented approach, then the way we fund that and we, develop the proposals for that needs to take place as well. I'll be very honest, I might get slapped for it, but what I see is that mindset is perhaps changing amongst partners, partly because by working more collectively, perhaps that conversation is more out there. It's more difficult as you go into multi-sectors, but you can still move that conversation along. But we're not always supported by our agencies. So there's to have that multi-sectoral approach. So there's a bit of educating and a bit of advocacy and push to be done there. In terms of supporting local actors in coordination, again, I think we just have to be extremely assertive. One, that we clearly have identified our partners who can take on those functions, have faith in them to do that function, provide them with the support needed, as other people have said, and make that very explicit request to donors. The question then has to be, as we're seeing from all the studies, is whether an international partner intermediary is always required or whether there can be direct funding. But again, what we're seeing with some of the joint proposals that we're putting in, you encompass your coordination requirements within that. And it doesn't matter if it's national, international. The funding's there, the roles and responsibilities are clear, the indicators that you're going to hold people to account for in terms of delivery and quality are there too. But that's a mindset that we still have a lot of work to do to shift as partners, as lead agencies, as donors.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm gonna move it on because we're obviously inevitably short of time. And the final question to the panel, which is, how can we best engage the most effective combination of national and international actors in outbreak response? So talking to a lot of what has just been bubbling up here. And Virginie, if I could go to you on this one initially. And I also would like to introduce, on top of and I'll repeat the question again for you. So how can we best engage the most effective combination of national and international actors in outbreak response? And I'm going to introduce also the question of confidence to engage in outbreak response, which is something that for medical agencies, they all charge in with their jargon. But for those agencies that may be multi-sector or less heavily medicalized, how do we best imbue them with the confidence that is required to engage in something that's quite risky? So again, a double-barrel question. Virginie, please.
Yeah, thanks. So definitely confidence is there from trust, and it does take time. And I think this is the whole thing we're talking about today, right? It's not only about response, but it's about preparedness. And I think we've seen it in Lebanon with COVID-19, some very small CBOs who were engaged in communication with communities under the COVID-19 response were then known by international partners and were actively involved in the cholera outbreak response. So I think it's a learning journey, and we shouldn't be expecting it to start directly. Now, if I'm going back a bit more generally to your question around how do we engage the most effective combination, I think the answer first is complementarity, is to acknowledge that it's not in all situations internationals who are the best position, but it's not in all situations nationals who are the best positioned. We have to acknowledge that impact is driven by this complementarity. Then I think, again, going back to this preparedness approach, having all those actors regularly engage in sector/cluster meetings really makes the difference, because people do know each other. And for this, we also have to make sure that we keep our famous 5 Ws updated, so that we don't have a response and then usually an international actors, kicking off an intervention and not realizing that there is a small actor who could have done it in partnership with them without any access issues and so on and so forth. So I think that those 5 Ws are really key, and their update is even more important. And then just going back to the previous reflection of Linda around, how do we use resources to effectively engage? I think we also have to get out of this thing that the only solution is direct funding, or is the funding coming from a donor that has a policy preventing them from supporting directly local actors. It can be a consortium approach. It can be an approach where the local NGO is going to be a partner of the INGO. The important thing in there is principles of partnership. I strongly encourage all of you to refer to those principles of partnership: equity, transparency, accountability. No matter how the money is being channeled, the important thing is this equity in partnership. And this really makes a difference in the combination between international and national.
Thank you. And Emmanuel, I'm going to pass to you the same question, but so drawing on your experience, most recently and currently, again, how do we establish, how can we best engage the most effective combination of national and international actors? And I know you've been working in a context where that has been a perennial challenge, but please, your thoughts.
Yeah, David, I think echoing Virginia's sentiments, I think this question also is in tandem with the localization agenda. So my take is that there should be meaningful partnerships between international agencies and national agencies. And for this, I will encourage a consortia approach. This is happening. In most cases, you find a national NGO is in a consortium with an international partner. But then, over time, I think in most cases, you will find that the national NGO is an implementing partner of the national of an international agency. That is something that usually, personally, I don't agree with. Initially, it's fine, but you find a case where you find a national NGO is an implementing partner for international NGO for an extended period of time, 6 years, 5 years, it is still an implementing partner. So I would recommend a scenario whereby those long partnerships are good, but gradually we see a national NGO taking more responsibilities and coming up playing like a co-partner, not just an implementing partner for an NGO, but rather a co-partner. I think that way we are able to ensure that that this is taken care of, and that
oh, I think we've lost the feed again. So apologies to Emmanuel. Paul, if I can come to you, and just to give you 2 seconds to gather your thoughts. Again, the question is, how do we best engage the most effective combination of national and international actors in an outbreak response?
Thanks, David. I think I will just still echo what Virginie and Manuel mentioned about talking about localization agenda, working on the consortiums and the principles of partnership. What I would be able to add is we need really to work together. We need really to magnitudes or outbreaks of such magnitudes of like Ebola, COVID-19, cholera, and meningitis, or whatever. is an opportunity for improved integration and communication and good collaboration among the actors, which is really essential, either be it national governments, national organizations, or international. So for me, I think planning together in the consortium, working together, responding together, building capacity of the local organizations because of the expertise that international organizations comes with, I think it's something that can really be taken in, because at long run, these national organizations remain and international organizations, for example, leave. So it would be good, really, an opportunity with outbreaks. This gives an opportunity for international organizations to build the capacity of the national organizations. So I think the principle of partnership and localization remains really a key important issue that really needs to be built in, or bought an idea of for this kind of partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to have time for one more question. There's an interesting one here on the sort of long-term impact. Right, I'll try and give this question justice. Outbreaks have complex and intersecting impacts on social arrangements. So I'm assuming beyond the purely medical. These changes can result in measurable health impacts and have long-term consequences. I've lost it now. Sorry. So how do we best address the consequences of outbreaks which go beyond the purely medical, and how do we incorporate this in our coordination mechanism? And I'll say, just to preface this, most of the ones that I've been involved in have been heavily medical. There clearly have been other sectors that have been included: wash, nutrition, education, protection, etc. But they have been heavily medical with all of the jargon that Virginie mentions earlier. So how do we best secure against that? And Virginie, can I go to you?
Yeah, I think they're a very practical example of this that we've seen in Lebanon. And I know it's not only about Lebanon, right? Regular immunization programs were impacted by COVID-19 because people did not trust anymore the vaccine. But then the answer to this was not a health answer. The way we've been rebuilding the trust towards this was with mainly education and child protection partners. And interestingly, the first thing we had to do is to convince those NGOs about what was the interest in the immunization thing. So I think that there, and again, it shows that if you're working with a well-established network of partners, it's going to work. If you have to start from scratch to identify those actors, to build a trust with them, it's going to take a very, very long time. And there we're talking about immunization, and we don't have time for regular immunization programs. We have to keep them running, right?
Thank you. Thank you. We are almost out of time. But I'm going to quickly, I think, ask a couple of panelists just to share some final thoughts on any of this. So in general, on coordination, just very quickly, last pithy thought. Linda, if I could just come to you.
Thanks, David. Well, I think I'll kind of repeat what I said at the beginning. So coordination isn't a thing that just happens willy-nilly. It's something that needs to be thought about. It needs to be considered in the readiness stage. People need to understand what existing coordination mechanisms are and who the key players are, and know what the entry points are. And then I go back to the point that as a partner, please be exceptionally clear on what your capacities and offer is and your contribution to a response. Because knowing that from the outset, positioning yourself well, making yourself known is absolutely what we need from the outset, not to discover it halfway through a major event. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think I've probably got to come to the closing comments now. And I do apologize. We probably haven't had time to do full justice to this topic. It is complex. It is very wide ranging. There are enormous number of aspects to it. And apologies to all those who did contribute really interesting questions that we just haven't had time to get to. So first off, I would like to thank all of the panelists, Linda, Virginie, Paul, and Emmanuel. Thank you so much. Apologies that we lost the feed once or twice through that, but I think the thoughts were deep, were useful, and it was a very rich discussion. So thank you so much to all of the panelists. And thank you to everybody who has come along online to listen and to participate. Once again, to remind you that the document on infectious disease outbreak response coordination is on the Ready website. There are links in the chat to it. And do please look at the other resources that relate to outbreak response and the sort of top tips, advice, different sectoral guidelines within the Ready website that can greater assist your ability and your organization's ability to take part and engage. Because I think what we are trying to do is to ensure that more organizations are able to meaningfully take part in outbreak response, and that we don't miss out on all of the expertise, skills, and community engagement that is out there and is perhaps not tapped into to its fullest extent. So to that, I would say thanks to the panelists, thanks to everybody for attending, thanks to Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and once again, thank you to all of you for your questions. And we'll end it there. Goodbye.